Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we're heading into early medieval Bengal. It's the Varendra Rebellion, an event full of twists and turns, and definitely some unexpected insights into power dynamics, social structures, and the role of religion in shaping history.
I think it's a story that's really going to challenge some of our assumptions about this period.
Absolutely. We're talking about a possible peasant uprising, a mysterious dynasty linked to, get this, boatmen and fishermen.
Wow.
And a king who may have prioritized the needs of everyday people over powerful elites.
Right, yeah.
Buckle up, because this deep dive is about to get really interesting.
Yeah, so for this deep dive, we'll mainly be using the Wikipedia article on the Varendra Rebellion. And it's a really good starting point because it pulls from a variety of sources, historical texts, and inscriptions, which I always appreciate. Gives us a multifaceted view of the events. Perfect.
So to set the scene, we're in the Varendra region of Bengal, roughly equivalent to parts of modern-day Bangladesh and India. The year's around 1070 CE. Can you paint us a picture of life in this era?
I would say, imagine a lush landscape crisscrossed by bustling trade routes. This is a time of cultural flourishing with both Buddhism and Hinduism deeply embedded in society.
And this is where the Pala Empire comes in, right? They were the dominant force in the region at the time.
Exactly, yeah. The Palas, they were a powerful dynasty who had ruled over much of Bengal and beyond for centuries. They were known for their patronage of Buddhism, their impressive architectural achievements, and, their role in promoting trade and scholarship. So, they had a pretty good thing going.
Yeah. But as we know, even seemingly prosperous empires can have cracks in their foundations. Enter the Varendra Rebellion. Can you tell us more about the rebellion itself and the key players involved?
Yeah, so the rebellion centered around a group known as the Kaivartas, and their identity is still debated by historians, which makes this whole thing even more interesting. Some sources depict them as a low-status group associated with occupations like fishing and boating. But other sources suggest that they were immigrated into landholding and even Brahminical society, so, implying a higher social standing.
You mentioned conflicting information about the Kaivartas. Some sources say they were low-status fishermen, while others suggest they were landowners, maybe even Brahmins. What do you make of this discrepancy? Does it say something about how their role in society might have changed over time? And how does this impact our understanding of the rebellion itself?
That's a great question, and that's what makes this so complex, is because this conflicting information adds another layer, right, to the story.
Yeah.
It's possible that the Kaivartas weren't a monolithic group, right? So perhaps their social standing varied depending on, the specific time and place. Or maybe their role in society evolved, and that shift in status, that contributed to the tension that led to the rebellion.
That's fascinating. It really highlights how historical narratives are rarely straightforward.
Exactly. And this ambiguity about the Kaivartas' identity, it makes it harder to pin down the exact reasons behind the rebellion. Were they a marginalized group seeking to overthrow the elite? Or were there, more complex social and economic factors at play?
Right. Well, the Wikipedia article suggests this might have been one of the first peasant revolts in Indian history. That's a pretty significant claim.
It is, and it really challenges our understanding of ancient Indian society, right?
Yeah.
Because we tend to associate peasant uprisings with later periods, but the Varendra Rebellion suggests that social unrest and resistance to authority were present much earlier than we might think.
Okay, so let's talk about the rebellion itself. What do we know about how it unfolded?
Okay, so from what we can piece together, the rebellion began with the Kaivartas, led by a figure named Divya, successfully capturing the entire Varendra region.
Wow.
They even managed to kill the Pali king Mahipala II.
Wow, killing the king, that's a bold move. So it sounds like the rebellion was incredibly successful, at least in its early stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And Divya even established himself as the ruler of Bauda, the Pala capital, and held on to power for a considerable period. He even fended off attacks from neighboring kingdoms, which suggests a high level of organization and military skill on the part of the rebels, right?
Right.
It wasn't just a spontaneous uprising. They had a plan and the means to execute it.
This all paints a picture of the Palas as significantly weaker than we might have initially assumed.
Yeah, it challenges that perception of them as an unassailable force, right?
Right.
But of course, empires don't just crumble overnight, they fight back.
Exactly. And I'm guessing the Palas weren't going to go down without a fight?
Absolutely not. A Pala king named Ramapala eventually emerged as the leader determined to reclaim Varendra. He rallied his forces and launched a counteroffensive.
I imagine that wasn't a simple task. I mean, retaking lost territory after a rebellion like this must be incredibly challenging.
Oh, absolutely. The Wikipedia article mentions that Ranapala had to go beyond just military might, right? He had to enlist the support of these various regional chiefs and offered them, generous rewards to secure their loyalty.
Wow.
Which shows just so much the rebellion had destabilized the region and weakened the Pala Empire. They had to forge new alliances and really play the game of power to regain control.
So it sounds like Ramapala was as much a shrewd politician as he was a military leader.
Yeah, absolutely right. He understood the complexities of the situation and knew that brute force alone wouldn't be enough. He had to be strategic and build alliances to succeed, and ultimately it paid off.
So he managed to regain control. Did that mark the end of the Varendra Rebellion?
Yes, eventually Ramapala's forces defeated the Kaivartas. Their final ruler, Hima, was executed, and the Varendra region was brought back under Pala control.
Okay, so it seems like a decisive victory for the Palas, but I have a feeling the story doesn't end there.
You're right, it doesn't. The Varendra Rebellion, even though it was ultimately quashed, had lasting consequences for the Pala Empire and the region as a whole. But before we dive into those, let's go back and explore the motivations behind the rebellion in a bit more detail.
Yeah, it's important to remember that the Varendra Rebellion didn't happen in a vacuum. It was a product of its time, shaped by, social, economic, and religious forces at play in Bengal during this period. That's a great point. So let's delve into some of those potential motivations for the rebellion. The Wikipedia article mentions a few interesting possibilities. For example, it highlights the potential influence of the Siddha movement.
The Siddha movement's fascinating. It was a religious tradition that gained traction in Bengal around this time. One of its key tenets was challenging authority, both religious and secular.
Okay.
And this emphasis on, individuals' spiritual experience and rejecting traditional hierarchies, well, it might have resonated with those who felt marginalized or oppressed within the existing social order.
So it sounds like a movement that could have easily inspired a rebellion against the established powers. But was it just a religious movement? I mean, were there also economic factors involved?
Most likely, yeah. The article mentions something called futis, which were essentially land grants, often associated with Kaivartas.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? What exactly were these futis, and what do they tell us about the Kaivartas' position within society?
Okay, so futis were grants of land, often given by rulers to individuals or institutions in exchange for, service or loyalty. And the fact that Kaivartas were associated with these land grants suggests they weren't simply a homogenous group of impoverished fishermen. They likely held some degree of economic power and influence.
It sounds like the picture's getting more complex here. We have this group, the Kaivartas, whose social and economic position seems to be more nuanced than we might have initially thought. And they're influenced by religious movements that challenge the status quo. I mean, it's a recipe for potential conflict.
Exactly, and it makes you wonder, if Kaivartas were involved in landholding, were they possibly resentful of the growing influence of Brahmins, who traditionally held significant power and control over land resources? Could this have been a contributing factor to the rebellion?
It sounds like we're talking about a potential class conflict here, rather than just a rebellion of a low-caste group.
That's a really astute observation, and it's likely a combination of factors, right? Social hierarchies, economic inequalities, religious ideologies all played a role in creating the conditions that led to the Varendra Rebellion.
This is a perfect example of why we can't just rely on those simplified historical narratives. We need to dig deeper and consider the complex interplay of various forces at play.
I completely agree, and it's a good reminder that history is rarely neat and tidy, right? It's messy, or full of contradictions and ambiguities.
So we've talked about the possible motivations behind the rebellion. Now let's shift gears and talk about the aftermath. You mentioned earlier that the rebellion had lasting consequences, even though it was ultimately crushed. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. While Ramapala's victory did restore Pala authority, the empire never fully recovered from the rebellion. They had been weakened militarily, politically, and their resources had been depleted.
It sounds like the rebellion, even in defeat, left a permanent mark on the Pala Empire.
Exactly. Think of it like a wound that never quite heals. It might scab over, but it remains a point of vulnerability.
What were some of the long-term consequences of this wound? Did it lead to further instability or change in the region?
It definitely did. The rebellion created a power vacuum in Bengal. The Palas, weakened and vulnerable, struggled to maintain their grip on power. And this opened the door for new dynasties like the Senas to rise to prominence. They capitalized on the Palas' weakness and eventually established their own rule in the region.
Wow, it's amazing to think that a single rebellion, even one that was ultimately crushed, could have such a profound impact on the trajectory of an entire region.
Yeah, and it really highlights how seemingly isolated events can have ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate context. The Varendra Rebellion wasn't just a blip on the radar, it was a catalyst for significant political change in Bengal.
And this change wasn't just limited to the political landscape, was it?
You're right, it wasn't. The Varendra Rebellion also has implications for our understanding of social and religious change in India during this period. Remember those deathies, the land grants we discussed earlier?
Yeah, the ones that suggested the Kaivartas might have held a more elevated social and economic position than traditionally thought.
Precisely. And the article mentions that during the rebellion, Kaivartas might have dispossessed Brahmins of their land grants. This detail, if true, is incredibly significant because it suggests a direct challenge to the traditional caste hierarchy and the power of the Brahmin elite.
It sounds like a radical shift in the social order, at least temporarily. But was this just a fleeting moment of upheaval, or did it have a lasting impact?
It's hard to say for sure, but historians have debated the extent to which the Varendra Rebellion represented a genuine movement for social equality. Even though the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it's possible that it planted the seeds for future social and religious reforms, by disrupting the existing order and challenging traditional power structures.
So even though the Kaivartas didn't achieve lasting political power, their rebellion might have contributed to a broader shift in social and religious consciousness.
That's a really insightful way to put it. The rebellion may have acted like a crack in the foundation, exposing vulnerabilities in the existing social order.
It makes you wonder what might have happened if the rebellion had been more successful. Could it have led to a more radical restructuring of society?
It's certainly a tantalizing thought, but even in its failure, the Varendra Rebellion serves as a powerful reminder that even the most deeply entrenched hierarchies can be challenged.
And it highlights the power of those often overlooked groups in history to disrupt the status quo and push for change.
Absolutely. And speaking of overlooked groups, the Varendra Rebellion also sheds light on the complex interplay of different religious traditions in Bengal during this period.
We talked earlier about the possible influence of the Siddha movement, but the Wikipedia article also mentions that the rebels might have been associated with Vajrayana Buddhism. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Vajrayana Buddhism, with its emphasis on tantric practices and esoteric rituals, was quite popular in Bengal during the Pala period. It was distinct from the more mainstream forms of Buddhism prevalent at the time.
Okay, so what made it distinct?
Well, some scholars believe that Vajrayana Buddhism, with its emphasis on personal experience and spiritual power, might have held particular appeal for those who felt marginalized within society. It offered a path to empowerment outside of the traditional hierarchies.
So potentially another factor contributing to the rebellion's roots, we have this fascinating blend of religious and social motivations intertwining to create the conditions for this uprising.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that religious beliefs weren't just abstract ideas. They had a profound impact on how people viewed the world, their place within it, and their relationship to authority.
It seems like the more we delve into this rebellion, the more complex and multi-layered it becomes.
It's true, the Varendra Rebellion really challenges us to rethink our understanding of this period. And before we move on, I want to touch on one more intriguing detail from the Wikipedia article.
I'm all ears. What is it?
It mentions that there are still physical remnants of the Kaivarta dynasty, like the Jarastamba pillar and locations named after King Hema.
Whoa, really? That's amazing. So we're not just talking about ancient texts and inscriptions here. We have tangible evidence, actual physical remnants of this dynasty that managed to seize control of Varendra, even if it was for a relatively short period.
Yeah, and these remnants aren't tucked away in some museum archive,
Right.
They're out in the world, integrated into the landscape of the Nairgon district of Bangladesh.
It's like a direct link to this, forgotten chapter of history. You can stand there looking at these structures and just imagine the events that unseated it around them.
It really underscores the power of archaeology and material culture in helping us understand history. Sometimes a single artifact, a standing structure, it can reveal more than pages and pages of written text. It brings the past to life in a way that words alone sometimes can't.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history isn't just confined to books, it's all around us, embedded in the landscape, in the objects we find, in the stories that have been passed down through generations.
That's a great point, and it brings us back to what we've been exploring today, the Varendra Rebellion, a story that challenges our assumptions about power, social structures, and the forces that shaped history.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will walk away with?
I think one of the most important lessons here is that even powerful empires are not invincible.
Right. They're susceptible to internal challenges, to social unrest, to the aspirations of those who seek a different order. It's a reminder that power is never absolute, and that change, even if it's ultimately unsuccessful, is always possible.
Exactly. And, the Varendra Rebellion also challenges us to question those simplified narratives we often encounter about ancient India. It's not just a story of grand empires and powerful rulers.
Right.
It's also about the struggles of everyday people, their beliefs, their aspirations, and their willingness to fight for a different future.
It's about those forgotten voices, those hidden stories that often get left out of the history books. And the Varendra Rebellion reminds us that these stories are worth uncovering, worth exploring.
Absolutely. They enrich our understanding of the past and help us see the world in a new light.
As we conclude this deep dive, what are some questions you think our listener might want to ponder? What threads could they pull on to continue their own exploration of this topic?
Oh, there are so many avenues to explore. For example, how might the Varendra Rebellion connect to later pendant uprisings in India? Are there common threads, shared grievances, or strategies that link these events across time?
That's a great question, and I think it also raises broader questions about social change and power dynamics. What does the Varendra Rebellion teach us about the enduring struggle for equality throughout history?
These are all questions worth contemplating. And remember, these aren't just abstract historical inquiries.
Right.
They connect to issues we still grapple with today.
Exactly. The past is never truly past. It shapes the present. And understanding it can help us navigate the complexities of the world we live in.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you and, of course, our listeners for joining us on this fascinating journey into the Varendra Rebellion. It's been a true deep dive.